the creepy experience of a 29-year-old nurse with an obsessive patient. The story of this 29-year-old nurse begins like any ordinary day at the hospital, where she was caring for patients. However, things took a strange and unsettling turn when she encountered a patient named Edward Dawson. He was admitted for a leg injury, but from the moment the nurse first interacted with him, she sensed something was off about his behavior. Edward's intense, mysterious gaze sent a chill down her spine. Though the hospital received many unusual patients, Edward stood out like a star with his peculiar actions. His constant staring and invasive personal questions about her life made the nurse feel deeply uncomfortable. After being discharged, everything seemed to return to normal, but this was just the surface. Edward wouldn't let go. One day, while the nurse was working, she received a sudden text from an unknown number. "You have such beautiful eyes, Emily. I can see so much through them." It was Edward. He not only found a way to contact her, but also started sending texts containing personal details she had never shared. These messages left her feeling terrified, unable to understand how he knew these things about her. Soon, Edward's stalking became more apparent. He unexpectedly showed up at the hospital where she worked and even claimed that he had become a nurse and was assigned to the same hospital. This left the nurse completely confused and frightened. She began to feel as though Edward was purposefully following her everywhere, as if he was always around, watching her every move. Gradually, Edward's harassment escalated. She began receiving frequent messages where he referenced moments from her day, things she hadn't told anyone. She couldn't fathom how he knew these intimate details. One day, as she was driving home after a long shift, she noticed a figure standing on the opposite side of the street, not far from her house. Her heart skipped a beat when she realized it was Edward. He was standing still, just staring at her. From that moment on, Edward's messages became more frequent and even more terrifying. She felt as if he was monitoring her every step, not just at work, but in her personal life too. One evening, while out with friends at a bar, she received an alert from her home security system. Edward was wandering around her house. At this point, her fear was unmistakable. Her friends urged her to call the police immediately. At a friend's house, the nurse and her friends watched the security footage. The situation grew tense as they saw Edward trying to break into her home. He attempted to open a window, climb onto the roof, and even tried to force the door. The fear surged, but they remained patient, waiting for the police to arrive. When the police finally showed up and arrested Edward, it felt as though the nightmare had come to an end. However, what the police discovered about Edward was even more chilling. It turned out that he wasn't a doctor or a nurse, as he had claimed. He was an imposter who had used the situation to gain access to her personal information from her medical records. It was horrifying to realize that he had been gathering personal details about her without ever being detected for a long time. After this traumatic event, the nurse could never forget the feeling of being watched for so long without realizing it. The strange messages, the unexpected encounters, and the fact that Edward knew private details of her life made her feel deeply violated. What had happened not only haunted her, but also forced her to confront serious questions about safety and privacy in the very profession she had always loved. This story is not just a warning about stalking, but also a reminder of the hidden risks involved in working in environments that may expose individuals to sensitive information. The relationships between doctors and patients, between nurses and those they care for, can sometimes develop into connections that are not easily predictable, and closeness in a professional setting does not always guarantee safety. This experience will forever be etched in the nurse's mind, and it serves as a lesson for all those working in healthcare. Ensuring privacy and maintaining vigilance in the face of unusual situations are essential aspects of their daily work. A nurse's chilling encounters with the supernatural and the dangerous. A 23-year-old nurse, still relatively new to the profession, was working in a hospice ward when she encountered Mr. Jacobson, a terminally ill, blind patient. His condition had long since deteriorated, and his prognosis was grim. He had only a few days to live. But what truly unsettled the nurse was not his physical state, but his unsettling behavior and eerie conversations. Despite his blindness, Mr. Jacobson seemed to have an unnerving ability to perceive things that were seemingly out of his reach. One evening, as the nurse was adjusting his IV, he spoke in a low, raspy voice. "Your grandmother is proud of you, Emily. She watches over you." The nurse froze, her heart skipping a beat. She had never mentioned her grandmother, who had passed away a few years earlier, to any of the patients. Yet, Mr. Jacobson had known her name. This wasn't the first time the nurse had been taken aback by Mr. Jacobson's cryptic comments. On multiple occasions, he spoke about life after death, recounting vivid details of what he described as the other side. His words were both comforting and deeply unsettling. He described the feeling of peace that would come once the soul passed on, a tranquility that he himself was waiting for. But the most chilling moment came when he started quoting her late grandmother. He repeated phrases that only the nurse's grandmother used to say, phrases that no one in the ward could possibly have known. How could this dying, blind man, who had never met her grandmother, speak with such intimate knowledge? The nurse couldn't explain it, but she could feel a cold shiver creep up her spine each time he spoke. While Mr. Jacobson's behavior was odd, it was nothing compared to the terror that awaited a nurse working in a mental hospital. This facility housed patients who had been deemed too dangerous for general psychiatric care. One of the most notorious patients was Jacob, a man whose violent tendencies were well known. He had been involved in multiple incidents of aggression, and it was a common protocol for staff to keep a careful eye on him. One evening, the nurse was assigned to check on Jacob. He was in his room, restrained, as was the standard procedure given his unpredictable behavior. However, when she entered the dark, cold storage room where he was kept, something felt wrong. The air was thick with tension, and the light overhead flickered, casting long, unsettling shadows across the walls. Suddenly, Jacob's eyes, wild and filled with malice, locked onto her. Before the nurse could react, he broke free from his restraints with shocking strength, lunging at her with a scalpel that he had somehow managed to hide. The sharp blade glinted in the dim light, and the nurse, adrenaline pumping, barely managed to dodge the attack. She stumbled backward, heart racing, as Jacob advanced with frightening speed. She had heard stories of his violent outbursts, but the raw aggression in his attack was unlike anything she had ever experienced. His eyes were wild, almost inhuman, and his movements were fueled by pure rage. The nurse managed to call for help, and within seconds security and other staff arrived, subduing Jacob before he could cause any serious harm. But the encounter had shaken her to the core. The sheer intensity of Jacob's violence, combined with his unnerving gaze, left a permanent scar on her memory. He was later transferred to a more secure facility, where his violent tendencies could be more tightly controlled. But for the nurse, no patient would ever be as disturbing as Jacob. Both Mr. Jacobson and Jacob were unforgettable patients, but in vastly different ways. Mr. Jacobson's cryptic insights into life after death left the nurse with a sense of unease, as though she had brushed up against something beyond the natural world. His death, when it came, was peaceful, almost too peaceful, as though he had known something the nurse couldn't understand. He had said, "Death is not the end, Emily. It is a continuation. You'll understand when the time comes." On the other hand, Jacob's violent outburst was a stark reminder of the darker side of mental illness. His unpredictable rage, his ability to break free from restraints, and his overwhelming strength made him a figure of pure fear. The nurse could never forget the feeling of being trapped in the dark room with him, with no escape in sight. The incident had left her with a heightened sense of caution, and she would never enter a room the same way again. Both patients left an indelible mark on the nurse, each in their own way. Mr. Jacobson's eerie connection to the afterlife made her question the boundaries between the living and the dead. It was as if he had been a conduit for something beyond her comprehension. Was it possible that his near-death experience had somehow allowed him to tap into a world beyond our own? The nurse couldn't answer that question, but she would often find herself staring into the dark, wondering if there was more to the world than she could see. Jacob's attack, on the other hand, had made her more vigilant, more cautious around patients who showed signs of aggression. It had taught her the hard way that danger could strike at any moment from a person who appeared to be restrained and harmless. The nurse carried the scars of that encounter for years, both physical and psychological. She learned to respect the unpredictability of human nature, understanding that sometimes the most dangerous situations come when you least expect them. These two patients, one who spoke cryptically about life after death, and the other who brought terror through his violence, taught the nurse that her work in healthcare would always involve walking a fine line between the known and the unknown. Whether facing the supernatural or the very real dangers of a disturbed mind, she learned to trust her instincts, to be alert, and to never underestimate the power of the human mind. Her experiences with Mr. Jacobson and Jacob remained etched in her memory, not as a source of fear, but as a reminder of the complexities of human existence. The living, the dying, the dangerous, and the unknown are all part of the same fragile web, and sometimes that web becomes impossibly thin. Unsettling encounters, the tech's mysterious stalker and the nurse's close call, the haunted phone calls of the X-ray technician. For an X-ray technician named Mark, life was usually quiet and routine. His shifts at the hospital were long, but predictable, filled with the standard tasks of taking images and ensuring the comfort of his patients. However, everything changed one evening when he began receiving mysterious phone calls. At first, they were just strange hang-ups, but as the days went on, the calls became more frequent and more unsettling. The voice on the other end of the line was always the same, low, breathy, and filled with a quiet intensity. "You don't know me, but I know you," the woman would say before hanging up abruptly. Mark thought it might be a prank at first, but the calls grew more disturbing with each passing day. The woman began to express anger toward him, accusing him of something he didn't understand. "I know what you did, Mark. You think I've forgotten, but I haven't. I'm going to make you pay." It was always the same voice, always the same cryptic threats. Mark tried blocking the number, but it didn't help. The woman would call again from different numbers, always finding a way to reach him. The fear began to gnaw at him. Who was this woman? Why was she targeting him? Then, one night, as Mark was winding down after a particularly grueling shift, he received yet another call. This time, the voice was much clearer, and it was full of fury. "I'm outside your house, Mark. You'll see me soon enough." His heart raced as he looked out the window. Nothing. The street was quiet. He quickly called the police, feeling a surge of panic as the minutes stretched on. At precisely 2 a.m., as Mark stood in his kitchen, still shaken by the call, a shadow passed by his window. He rushed to the door, looking out into the darkened street. There, standing just a few feet away from his front porch, was the woman. Her eyes were wide with rage, her face contorted in a mixture of fury and obsession. She began to approach, and Mark quickly backed away, grabbing his phone to call the authorities again. The woman, unperturbed, continued to walk toward him. By the time the police arrived, she had reached his front yard. They detained her without incident. As she was taken away in handcuffs, the woman screamed at Mark, calling him a liar and accusing him of ruining her life. Later, it was revealed that she had been stalking him for months, convinced that he had been involved in a tragic event years ago, a car accident that Mark had no memory of, nor any connection to. The woman, suffering from severe mental illness, had fixated on him as the source of her pain. Mark never understood how she had found him or why she had targeted him, but the terrifying experience left a permanent scar. He installed security cameras and alarms around his house, but the feeling of being watched never truly left him. The nurse's nightmarish close call. Nights out with friends were supposed to be an escape from the intensity of the nurse's everyday life. After long shifts at the hospital, a chance to unwind was exactly what Emily needed. But one fateful evening, her night of relaxation took a terrifying turn that she would never forget. It all started innocuously enough. Emily was having drinks with a few colleagues at a local bar. The music was loud, the crowd was lively, and for a while she felt at ease. But as the night wore on, she started to feel a strange sense of unease. Something didn't feel right. When she left the bar around midnight, the night air was cool and the streets were quieter. Emily walked toward her truck, parked a few blocks away, feeling the weight of the long evening as she glanced around the near-empty street. That's when she noticed a woman standing near a lamppost. The woman was staring directly at her, and as their eyes met, she gave Emily an almost unnerving smile. "Hey there, you look like you could use some company," the woman said, her voice slightly slurred, as if she had been drinking. Emily, somewhat startled, nodded politely and began to unlock her truck. As she did, the woman stepped closer, talking louder now, almost as if trying to distract her. "What's your name? Where are you from? It's so quiet tonight, don't you think?" Emily, trying to remain polite but sensing that something was off, tried to brush her off. "I'm sorry, I'm just heading home." But as she fumbled with the keys, the woman didn't back off. Instead, she moved even closer, and Emily's intuition screamed that something wasn't right. The woman's conversation felt forced, too intense, as though she was deliberately trying to keep Emily occupied. Just as Emily felt a chill run down her spine, she heard a noise behind her. Footsteps. She turned quickly, just in time to see a man, wearing a dark hoodie, creeping toward her truck. His eyes were fixed on her, and he was carrying something sharp. The woman had been distracting her while the man tried to sneak up from behind. Panic surged through Emily's body. She quickly dropped the keys and jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door just as the man reached the side of her truck. Her heart pounded as she locked the doors and started the engine, her hands trembling. In her rearview mirror, she saw the woman step toward the man, but instead of confronting him, she simply nodded and smiled, as though their plan had been set in motion. Emily didn't wait to find out. She peeled out of the parking lot, narrowly avoiding a confrontation, and sped off. After the adrenaline rush subsided, Emily found herself shaking uncontrollably. She couldn't understand what had just happened. The pair had been trying to rob or harm her, and she had narrowly escaped. She didn't know why they targeted her, but it became clear that the area she had parked in wasn't safe. The next day, she avoided that part of the city completely and changed her routine. Both Mark's and Emily's experiences served as a chilling reminder of the dangers that can lurk just beyond the everyday. Mark's stalker had managed to fixate on him from the shadows, while Emily had narrowly escaped what seemed to be a premeditated attack. Both situations were unsettling in their own ways, yet the terror they caused had lingering effects. For Mark, the phone calls had shattered his sense of safety. He never felt quite as secure as he had before, constantly looking over his shoulder. The lingering fear of being watched became an obsession, and he took extreme precautions to protect himself. Emily, too, struggled to shake the paranoia of that night. She avoided her usual routes and stayed away from areas she had once frequented. Her once carefree nights out had become fraught with caution and suspicion. Mark and Emily both learned that danger can come from unexpected places, often when they least expect it. Whether it's a woman stalking you with cryptic threats, or a pair of criminals trying to harm you under the cover of darkness, the fear lingers long after the immediate threat has passed. For them, the lesson was clear. Always be aware of your surroundings and never underestimate the danger that can hide in the most seemingly innocent of encounters.